Hello everyone, today I'm going to talk about how to lay out your palette. I thought the easiest way to do this would be to show a presentation with a few images to kind of show you how to better organize your palette and keep consistent with it. Again, remember, one of the things I really want to stress this semester is being consistent and being precise. So do things with a little bit of intention and planning. So I want to talk about palette. First of all, I wanted you all to do that organizational kind of color chart where you mix the colors. This will be really helpful. Now you could always expand on this as well by adding tints and shades, by adding more colors to the mix and kind of submixing from them. But color charts like this are really helpful to know what you're going to encounter when you're mixing colors, whether one set of colors will mix on the cooler side or warmer, whether they tend to be more transparent or more opaque. So it's really helpful to do that and use this as a guiding exercise. So do it first as opposed to after your painting, so that while you're working on your painting, you have that chart. I want to show a great female artist from our World Art 2 class that we're talking about, Judith Leister and her self-portrait that she did. Here's an idea of organizing your palette. You can see she neatly has her palette in her hand as well as a lot of brushes. And she's organized, she's ready to go, she's ready to paint. And she would consistently lay out her paints the same way when she would work. So this is really helpful to do this as an artist. This is kind of some of the what to avoid. Here's Van Gogh's palette. Now, I'm not saying don't be Van Gogh, because obviously his paintings were amazing. But sometimes when we say palette, right, when we think about the artist's palette, we don't just think about the actual physical palette that they used. You can see they both have this kind of rounded palette. In the case of Judith Leister with a thumb, so you can stick your thumb through it, or this one's a little bit more square and the brush is in his hands. You can see this one's nice because it has little mixing cups attached to it that you could have your linseed oil, have your terpenoid in. But sometimes we think of color palette as meaning the artist's palette and their color choices they make. So you can kind of see, in a way, Van Gogh's palette looks like one of his paintings physically, like the colors he would use, how thick it is, how expressionistic it is, and so how you organize that is very, very helpful. This is another great artist we talked about in World Art 2, Sofonisba Anguissola, and you can see her palette here. You can also see she's using what's called a maul stick. That's really, really helpful. What you can do is get a wooden dowel, a little stick, or just a piece of wood, thin piece of wood. And what you can do is put a little padding on the very end of it. That way it doesn't disturb. In her case, hers is just almost looks like a drumsticks that a drummer would use, and it doesn't have this padded end to it here, but you could wrap a little bit of fabric in leather and tie that up, or another piece of thicker fabric, so that way if you ever lean it onto the painting, it doesn't smudge it or smear it, it doesn't ruin the canvas, or you could lean it on the very end. So what this does is, if you lean this maul stick onto your canvas, you can rest your arm and your brush on that, and you're not having to touch your canvas. So this is super helpful. I encourage you all to get one, to make one, to pick one up. So that's what that's for. Again, color palette. When we think about like an artist palette, here's an example. This is Whistler. This is his painting on the right, and on the left is his actual palette that you can see that he used and how he laid it out. What is good about this is really helpful. This is like a manual, like a user's manual, and how to lay out your color palette. And what he would do then is specifically put the paints in the exact same spot each and every time. And you can see there's kind of a rhyme or a reason to his palette. And this is what I suggest you do as well when you're laying out your palette, is you put the darkest colors on the left and moving over to the lightest colors on the right. We talked about this in painting one, but I think it's even that much more important in oil painting, because you could have colors intermix longer because of the open time. So say your palette isn't completely scraped clean and you have a little bit of paint that's still open or wet. You put a yellow over top of a green or a gray, and next thing you know, your colors are muddied. So if you always put them in the exact same spot, that's not going to be an issue. So that's really, really helpful. Again, being intentional, being precise. And if you look at this, what you can tell that Whistler did here is this is the lighter values here, working over to the darker. It doesn't necessarily have to make sense in terms of the color wheel, all cool to warm, but that's kind of how this is laid out. You've got the greens, blues, umbers, reds, orange, yellow, white. It's kind of a nice way of laying it out. This is what your painting palette is probably going to look like once. And I like a glass palette, I'll be honest. I don't really like the wood ones. They're a little bit harder to clean, a little more unwieldy. The glass ones you can scrape with a paint knife or also a palette knife, or you could use a window scraper, one of those razor blades, to clean it up, which I suggested you all buy for this semester. So it's okay if, as you're working, your palette starts to look like this. You know who you are. You know, you can feel the shame right now as I'm you know, basically throwing you under the bus. But you can also keep in mind that having a little more structure to it, having a little bit more organized, if it kind of creeps like this, but the colors are still kind of separated, whereas this just becomes one big, huge muddled mess, and it makes it really difficult. So I'm going to show you a resource that we have on Schoology that I placed there that's helpful for color mixing and also for laying out your palette. One of the things that's really important to think about is warm versus cool colors. And this is vocabulary that you should be familiar with from Painting 1 or from 2D Design. Thinking about color theory, the colors that are warm psychologically tend to feel hotter, have more of kind of an you know, fiery feel to them. Colors that are cooler tend to have more of an earthy feel to them, like water, like sky, and can change the color as you're mixing it. So when you're looking at these, using a color wheel, using a mixing guide is going to be really helpful because it's going to get you there further quicker where you can understand what a color is going to do. For instance, just obviously as you add yellow and red together, you know orange is in the middle of that. But what happens when you mix orange and blue? Or what if a color is already looking kind of bluish and you want to get rid of that? What do? You add the opposite. You add its complementary contrasting pair, in this case orange, and I'll show you some examples of that. But the other thing I want you to think about warm versus cool is how individual colors, so generally speaking, kind of if you split this right down the middle, right, and you've got warmer colors on this side, roughly, warmer colors here, cooler colors on this side, right, cooler, yeah, warmer, cooler. But also each individual color is going to have a bias. It's so two reds, you might think, oh, they're both red colors. Well, true, magenta is warm, and when you compare it to blue, it's definitely warmer than blue. But if you compare a red to another red, one's going to have a warm and one's going to have a cool. Perhaps that's why we have our paints are what's considered a double primary set. That's where you have a warm red and you have a cool red. And if you have a warm red, that's going to be really great for mixing warm colors. If you have a cool red, that's going to be great for mixing cool colors like violet, like purple. You're going to want to use your cooler red, like magenta, to mix a purple. You can mix all day long if you're trying to make a green. If you keep mixing warmer yellow and warmer blue, it's not going to go towards that cooler green like you want. It's going to have a bias towards warm as opposed to cool. So think about how each color in and of itself can have a warm tint to it or a cool. So it's going to either have a yellow bias in this case, kind of squint and see the undertone, you kind of see some yellow in it. Whereas if you squint and look at the magenta, you kind of see a bluish bias to it. So each color, in addition to it being, you know, either red, or blue, or yellow, it's going to have H, S, and V. It's going to have hue, it's going to have saturation, and it's going to have value. It's going to be lighter or darker. What does that mean? Well, when you're thinking about mixing colors like, for instance, green, that means when you go to take, you know, if you take cerulean blue versus cobalt blue, it's already, one's going to be already darker than the other. One's going to be warmer than the other. So one's going to have a darker value automatically using one blue. We're using cobalt blue versus cerulean blue. It's lighter. One's going to go a little bit more warm. One's going to be a little more cool. So when you're laying out a palette like this, look at this. This is, you know, using a blue that tends to be a little bit cooler. And then this is using a blue over here that is warmer, that tends a little bit more towards yellow, which can be really, really helpful. And then sometimes it's really exaggerated out once you start to add white to it, once you start to do tints of that color. Look at how green this gets, right? And this color here, you would never think to substitute this color for this color. If this is what the painting requires, then you wouldn't want to substitute this color over here. You'd want to use this color. So starting with the right kind of parent colors is going to really make a big difference when you do color mixing. The last thing I want to stress is local color. Local color is the actual color of an object. So in the case of these apples, red is the local color. But the ambient light, the light in the room, is going to affect that local color of red. So in some cases it'll go bluish, it'll go purple in the shadows. It might go a little bit warmer, a little more yellow towards the highlights. And so when you're working, think about these areas of being local color, what you would need to mix, putting that on your palette, and then adding, say, blue or green to it to subdue it, to make it more muted, adding yellow to it or white to get these highlights. If you look at this particular apple right here, it's going to have some areas that are bluish, purplish. It's going to have some areas that are more orange and yellow towards the top. Think about on how an object, this one right here is a great example. If you think about this, for instance, is the main local color. Then you have where the light source is blocked, where it's getting a little bit darker, where it's shaded, curving away from the light. You're going to add blue, you're going to add purple. And some people, and you can see that in the shadows, it's bluish, it's purplish. Some people like to use a cooler color to block in their values to begin with. So if you're starting to do a painting of an apple, you could start to paint it bluish or purplish to begin with, so that when you lay the reds over top of it, some of that blue, some of that purple comes through, and it's going to make it look a little bit more shaded. At the bottom here, what I have is, this is an example of taking yellow and violet and seeing what's on the opposite side of the color wheel, and how by doing mid-mixtures, you can get some really beautiful what's called chromatic grays, which you might remember we talked about that in painting. But this is going to give you a lot of helpful information when you're working, like if you're doing apples, if you take the red, you take the green, it's going to give you a tertiary, it's going to give you a color in between that's just like this chromatic gray to neutralize the color, and can be really, really helpful. And so sometimes these complex colors are really helpful to have as you're working, to be thinking about how you can make chromatic grays as opposed to monochromatic grays using just black or white. Next thing I want to show you is in the resources on our Schoology. So if you look at here on Schoology, on our painting page, this is listed. So under materials, if you click on resources, I have a few things here. I have a link to color mixing. So you can expand this, go to this website. This is some nice, helpful tips about color mixing with oil paints. Just some handy information to figure out what you should use in a particular case. And then the other resource that I wanted to show you was really helpful, relates to today, what we're talking about in terms of laying out your palette, is this little helpful guide. This artist did a blog to show how she likes to lay out her palette, and it's kind of similar to what we talked about, dark to light, and keeping these kind of mother puddles, as we call them in painting, to be able to mix further colors off of that. So if you click on this link right here, laying out your palette, and click on this link here, this is this artist Sharon Tarr, and what you'll see is she lays out on one side, on the left, her colors from dark to light, like this. These are her earth tones on this side. And then from the top, the warmer tones here. You could lay this all out in one layer, so it doesn't necessarily have to be more of this kind of like right angle. You could go all at the top like I showed you on Turner's, or curving around your palette. But look at this. This is what we call mother puddles here. So every time You start a painting, you have these colors laid out, your prismatic colors, your colors prismatic right out of the tube, those colors right out of the tube, and kind of play them out in little puddles or pools, you know, fairly thick, and from left to right, going darker to lighter, and always putting them in the same spot, which is really helpful to stay organized. And you might put a little bit of black, a lot of black on the left, a lot of white on the right, so as you're mixing. The next thing, this next layer right here, is the colors for your particular painting. So if you know you're going to be using a lot of teals or reds, try to color mix those exactly and put those in the next level, saving this space down here, a big open space for intermixing those colors. And then what you do is, and you could take, you know, and splitting them up a little bit, these are the colors you're mainly going to be using in your palette. You could very easily drag this down and put it in two separate sections and say, what if I add a lot of yellow to this here? What if I add a lot of blue to this here? To change that same color, to give you variations. Every now and again, once you're done with a color, you might need to wipe off your palette with paper towels or scrape it. And what I would really suggest, now I've mentioned if you're working on a painting and you're going to be working on it for a few days, uninterrupted, consecutively for a few days, go ahead and wrap it with saran wrap and it'll stay okay as long as it's on a surface that isn't absorbent. But if you're kind of done for the day and you might not paint for a day or two or a few days, scrape them up and you can save, you can put them, either wrap them up in saran wrap and then you can kind of just snip the end of it and squeeze it back out next time, or you could get little cups that have lids on it to seal up your paint when you're done. And then that way you're, at the end of the day, you kind of clean up your palette, start from scratch, and the next time kind of lay it out in that same system or way of organizing. I hope this is helpful. I hope you understand kind of the importance, the emphasis on staying neat and orderly. Also, you'll notice a lot of times artists will have multiple brushes lined up. That's so you don't have to switch colors, or you can have a color that's dedicated to your reds, your blues, your greens the whole time you're painting, so you don't have to keep washing them out. That's really helpful. Or cleaning them off. I mean, you could use just one brush, but that's when artists tend to get muddy colors, is they're not properly cleaning it and graying out or neutralizing their colors if they say switch from violet to yellow. So I hope this is helpful. If you have any other questions as you're setting up your palette, holler at me, just let me know, shoot me a text, we can Zoom. But I also want you to upload, so you're going to upload your drawing once you have it squared up. You're going to upload your painting color chart that you do, and I also want you to show me your palette the first time you set it up, so we can kind of see how we are doing on this system. So, peace. See y'all.